Hello, and welcome to our week on critiquing the sociological canon. This week, we're going to look particularly at critiques by and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and issues. A word of warning, the lectures do contain images of Aboriginal people who have passed away. Please remember that your course coordinator and the university systems are here to support you if you find any of the material distressing. So, let's think about what you've learned so far in sociology. You know that we're looking at society, but one of the things that you'll also already be aware of is that that can happen through a series of what we call lenses, different ways that we approach problems and different structures that help us to do that. So as we go through the different modules this week, you're going to be able to see some of the ways that you might bring in an Indigenous perspective, include Indigenous knowledges, and prioritise Indigenous voices where it's appropriate. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. Nyali Najigun, Nyali Garama Malajigun. We come from this country, we look after this country. As you go through your studies at the university, you may be at events or lectures where either a welcome or an acknowledgement to country is performed. With a welcome, you're often being welcomed to the country by an elder or a traditional owner. An acknowledgement is something that anyone, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, can perform. And it is about acknowledging that you are a guest on someone else's country. So for me, as a Worimi and Bundjalung woman, I'm a guest on the Darkinjung country where I live and where I'm recording this lecture. So as you go through sociology, you're going to be asked to critique materials, to critique questions that are posed to you, and to critique society in general. Now, sometimes, especially in the first year, people think about critiquing as being criticising. Criticising, though, is about fault finding, and it's often a really emotive response. So we might look at something and say, I don't like that, or I really hate that, or I love that. That's not what we do in an academic setting. In an academic setting, we evaluate. So we look at whether or not there's evidence to support what's being said. We analyse. So that could be comparing what's been said or what we're reading to other resources. It could be relating it to things like laws. So we know that, for instance, in Australia, there are anti-discrimination laws about a whole range of different factors. So when we're doing our critique, we're thinking about sometimes not just what do we think, but how can this be read in a broader social, economic, and political context. So when we go to critique sociology, you're going to become familiar as the course progresses with things like a feminist critique of society, which looks at issues of gender. You might look at an economic critique. So through a certain economic lens, it makes sense, for instance, to have tax relief. But in sociology, we're not just looking at the economics, we're looking at what are the outcomes of those economic practices and policies being put in place. And so we know that historically, there are certain ways in which things like economics and inclusion and exclusion from the employment market, from being able to receive government allowances, all of those kinds of things can really affect people's social standing, and that in turn has a flow-on effect to most, if not every other area of their life. So a critique that starts in one place might actually end up in terms of, what is the effect in another place entirely. So let's have a look at some examples of that. So when I was learning sociology at the University of Newcastle back in the 1990s, we had to do a core course called the History of Sociological Thought. And that revolved around the work of three men that are called the founding fathers of sociology: Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. And so what I got there was a real grounding in how we can look at things like religion, work, economics, class, in a range of different ways. And so being able to compare and contrast to evaluate those differences was really useful. In a later class, I was introduced to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American sociologist. Now, just a quick note, I know that if we were speaking classical French, that his name would be pronounced Du Bois. But Du Bois was writing about race and power, and so he chose to use, I guess, a more, if you like, Americanized version of his name. And I'm going to talk about him in a little more depth later. But the founding fathers of sociology are really interesting because in a lot of ways they set a lot of the key themes that sociologists would consider later. And I want to really take some time, no matter how briefly, to think about the work of Emil Durkheim because it related specifically to Aboriginal people. So we have to remember that in the 1800s, there was a flood of information about Indigenous peoples globally that was being fed back to Europe. And so European thinkers, in a sense, used this as a data mine. They were like, wow, here's this research or reports of cultures that are different from ours. Let's see how they compare and let's see what conclusions we can make. Unfortunately, what they did was they looked through a lens of ethnocentrism, where their own cultures were seen as the most superior and desirable. Okay, and this is certainly the case with Durkheim. So Durkheim, read with some interest the work of two people that are often seen as leading anthropology, the development of anthropology in Australia, Spencer and Gillen. And they recorded, some of the cultural patterns and practices of Aboriginal people in Central Australia. So Durkheim reads this, and from that, he developed his book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. In that book, he created, if you like, a hierarchy or a continuum of the religious beliefs of humanity. And he places Aboriginal people at the very bottom. Okay, so you'll see here that I've put in inverted commas the most primitive. Sometimes when we look at historical materials, we find ways of speaking or writing that we wouldn't consider to be, correct or appropriate today. So we sometimes still use that in our discussion, but we indicate problematic by putting it in inverted commas. So we're indicating that it's not a word that we use, but it's coming in this particular context. So Durkheim, writes this text about Aboriginal people, international bestseller, still used in, some of the foundation courses around sociological thought. And so that really helped at the time to support racism against Aboriginal people, to support stereotypes, which meant that, policies were seen to be made in the best interests, again in inverted commas, in the best interests of Aboriginal people, because it was thought that Aboriginal people perhaps were not capable of making decisions for themselves. And so it's argued by anthropologists like Jeremy Beckett that in fact some of the controls that Aboriginal people have been subject to were similar to the laws and controls that could be enacted, for instance, on children. Okay, so it's not just that Durkheim writes this, it's that it has flow-on effects of building racist policy, practice, and stereotypes about Aboriginal and also Torres Strait Islander people. So now let's look at the work of Charles Darwin, who I'm sure that most of you will be familiar with for his theory on evolution and his ideas around the survival of the fittest in the animal kingdom. But these ideas were also applied to humanity, and we refer to that as social Darwinism. And unlike Durkheim, Darwin actually did travel and see Indigenous peoples. He even came to Australia and asked to be able to observe Aboriginal people, which he did at a number of sites. When Darwin wrote about the world's Indigenous people, but a lot of these terms he applied here, he wrote using terms like savage, hideous, primitive, hostile, miserable, filthy, and wretched. Now, some people say, well, he was a product of his time. And yes, at that time, that was one particular mindset. But if we look at the work in Lake Macquarie of the Reverend Lancelot Threadgold in the colonial period, we can see that he wrote about Aboriginal people and Aboriginal languages in a way that was much more sympathetic and, I would argue, having compared and evaluated the different texts, in a way that was more accurate. Okay, so Darwin, in one of his writings, compared the intellectual capability of an Aboriginal woman to his dog. And he said, "How little can the hard-worked wife of a degraded Australian savage, who uses very few abstract words and cannot count above 4, exert her self-consciousness or reflect on the nature of her very existence." Okay, so when we get the social scientists like Durkheim and the natural scientists like Darwin really saying very similar things, that Aboriginal people are at the very bottom of the development of humanity, that then helps, provide the foundation for policies and practices that really continue to impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So things like Aboriginal protection legislations can come about because there's this academic support for the idea that Aboriginal people really can't, be able to care for children, to manage money, to manage their housing, to be responsible for choosing their religions, and that these are decisions that really should be made for them by the state. So it's important to understand that even though these are historical works and, they're books, they're one person's opinion, they go on to influence generations of thinkers, and they also have these massive impacts in everyday life.